At this point in the course, we know what demand and supply is, and we know that the demand and supply interact to form a market, and that market allocates resources. Now we would like to investigate how the market allocation affects the well-being of the participants in the market, which are the buyers and sellers. So to do this, we first need to define a term, willingness to pay. So the willingness to pay is the maximum amount that a buyer is willing to pay for a good. And so willingness to pay is a metric for how much an individual values that good. So let's look at an example by defining some willingness to pay values for an iPhone. So we have 4 consumers with various willingness to pay values. So 250, 175, 300, and 125. So remember, this is the maximum that these consumers are willing to pay for the iPhone. It's what they truly value it at. And let's say that the price is $200. Well, anyone who has a willingness to pay above the price is going to purchase the iPhone. So that means consumer 1 and consumer 3 buy an iPhone since their willingness to pay is greater than the price. And this is also how we get the quantity demanded. So in this case, if these 4 individuals are market participants, then the quantity demanded is 2 at a price of 200. And so one of the things the willingness to pay lets us do is derive the demand schedule, which in turn is used to plot the demand curve. So willingness to pay is actually behind all the graphs we've looked at so far. So to do this, we can look at some prices. So let's say the price is greater than 300, and then we want to know who buys at that price, and then what is the quantity demanded. So if the price is greater than 300, that's higher than everyone's willingness to pay. So nobody buys, and the associated quantity demanded is 0. Now let's say the price is between 251 and 300. With this price, we've got consumer 3 who is willing to pay 300. So they'll pay as long as price is in this range. So we'll say consumer 3, and our quantity demanded is 1. Then from 176 to 250, we've picked up consumer 1. So now we have consumer 3, consumer 1, and a quantity demanded of 2. And then similarly, we can go 126 to 175. And if price is in this range, we'll get consumer 3, consumer 1, and consumer 2. And then finally, if price is less than 125, everybody will buy the iPhone. And we get a quantity demanded of 4. So now we can plot these values to get our demand curve. So if price is above 300, no one's going to buy. So that means for every value above 300, we plot a 0, which looks like a vertical line above 300. Then between 251 and 300, we have 1. So that's going to be a vertical line between 250 and 300. Then between 176 and 250, we have 2. Then between 126 and 175, we have 3. And then finally, if we're below a price of 125, have 4. And now if we connect these points, that gives us our demand curve. So obviously this doesn't look like the demand curves we've seen. That's because it's discrete. It's got this stair-step pattern because we only have 4 market participants. Another way to think about that is if you increase the number of market participants, you still get this stair-step effect, but you get a stair step for every person. So it might be really, really tiny stair steps like this. And the more market participants you add, the smaller those steps get until it just looks like a smooth line. So again, this graph is the demand curve, but it also represents each market participant's willingness to pay. So looking at our chart up here, consumer 3 has a willingness to pay of 300. And so if you pick any point on the x-axis and go up to the demand curve, that point is the what we call the marginal buyer's willingness to pay. So all that means is that it's the price that the last person to buy the iPhone would be willing to pay, if that makes sense. So at a quantity demanded of 2, consumer 3 and consumer 1 are going to purchase. And so in this case, consumer 3 purchases as soon as the price gets below 300. Consumer 1 won't purchase unless the price is below 250. So consumer 1 is the marginal consumer, in this case, the marginal buyer. So now that we know what willingness to pay is, we can define what we call consumer surplus. And consumer surplus is just the amount a buyer is willing to pay minus the price they pay for it. So we can abbreviate this as consumer surplus equals the willingness to pay minus price. So let's add a consumer surplus column to our chart over here, assuming the price is 200. So consumer 1 paid 200, but they would have paid 250. So their consumer surplus is 250 minus 200, or 50. Consumer 2 does not purchase the iPhone because their willingness to pay is below the price. So their surplus is 0, or if you want to say not applicable. Consumer 3 has a consumer surplus of 100, and consumer 4 doesn't purchase. And so we can evaluate the total consumer surplus of the market by just summing the individual surpluses of each consumer. So total consumer surplus in this case is 100 plus 50. And so this value is significant because we can use this to measure the welfare implications of a particular market allocation. Graphically, we can also identify the consumer surplus. So our price is 200. And so the consumer surplus is what the consumer is willing to pay minus the price. And so the consumer surplus is represented by the area below the demand curve down to the price. So in the case of consumer 3, who has a willingness to pay of 300, their consumer surplus is represented by this area here. And consumer 1's surplus is this area here. And so this whole area combined is the total consumer surplus in that market. So now let's extend our investigation here into a typical demand curve we see, which is nice and continuous and doesn't have those stair steps. And let's say the price is $30 for whatever this market is. Well, using what we took from the last slide, that means this whole area is the consumer surplus. And so in this case, we don't have a table to tell us what the values are for each individual, but we can calculate this area using some geometry, right? So this is a right triangle. And so we want to know this area. And if you recall, the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. So our consumer surplus in this case is 1/2 times the base, which is this distance here. We're going to fudge this line a little bit to make it 20 so our math is easy. And our height in this case is this area, or this length here, which is 60 minus 30. And this equals 600 over 2, or 300. So consumer surplus equals 300 at a price of 30. Now let's say our price rises to $40. So we were at 30, we're now at 40. And that means our new consumer surplus is this area. And this red area down here now represents lost consumer surplus. But we can divide this lost consumer surplus up into two areas. So if we drop a line down here, we've got two distinct areas. The green here, this is lost consumer surplus due to consumers paying a higher price, right? Because now their willingness to pay, they subtract the price, which is 40 now, whereas before it was only 30. And the red area that's left is lost consumer surplus due to marginal buyers leaving the market. These are consumers whose willingness to pay is not above the price of 40, so they just don't purchase the product when it goes above 40. So let's calculate the consumer surplus at this new price. So we have 1/2 base times height. So our base, say, is about 12, and height is from 40 to 60, which is 20. So this equals 240 over 2, or 120. So consumer surplus equals 120 at a price of 40. And then finally, let's calculate our change in consumer surplus. Right, so I'll notate this delta consumer surplus, which is going to be the consumer surplus at a price of 30 minus the consumer surplus at 40, which is 300 minus 120, which equals 180. So we say that the consumer surplus decreased by $180 when the price changed from $30 to $40. So that's it for analyzing the welfare of consumers. The next lecture will switch to the suppliers or producers and look at how to analyze their welfare.